Hello, my name is Olivia McLean, and this presentation covers the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989 and the U.S. national security response. I'll walk you through the key players, what happened, and how the U.S. used its intelligence and defense strategies to counter Soviet influence during the Cold War. To start, let's have a conflict overview. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979 to support a failing communist regime. The major players included the Soviet Red Army, Afghan Mujahideen, the CIA, Pakistan's ISI, and the U.S. Presidents Carter and Reagan. The war lasted until 1989 and was fought primarily in Afghanistan's rugged terrain. The Soviets sought to preserve influence in Central Asia, while the U.S. saw this as a threat to Cold War balance, responding with covert military aid to the Mujahideen. This was a proxy war between the U.S. and the USSR. The issue centered on Soviet expansionism and U.S. counteraction through covert aid. The stakes were high. Control over Central Asia and access to the Persian Gulf were on the line. This conflict reinforced the use of intelligence and covert operations by the United States, showing that indirect engagement could drain a rival superpower without direct confrontation. While tactically successful, the long-term strategic outcome created instability that would later fuel global terrorism. The Carter Doctrine made clear that the U.S. would defend its interests in the Persian Gulf. The National Security Council and Central Intelligence Agency led Operation Cyclone, funneling weapons and funding through Pakistan's ISI. The Department of Defense supported logistics, while the State Department coordinated diplomatic efforts. Saudi Arabia also co-financed aid to the Mujahideen. Inter-agent cooperation was very strong, but there was no long-term plan for post-war governance or leaving. This event helped solidify the National Security Council's Cold War policy of fighting through proxy wars. For critical thinking, I used a SWOT analysis to evaluate the U.S. approach during the Soviet-Afghan War. The strengths included highly effective use of covert operations like Operation Cyclone, strong interagency coordination between the CIA and NSC, and the ability to avoid direct U.S. military engagement. Weaknesses involved a lack of long-term strategic planning, an over-reliance on Pakistan's ISI, and empowering Mujahideen factions without vetting their ideology. Opportunities were present in reinforcing Cold War containment, expanding U.S. influence in the region, and boosting relationships with allies like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. However, threats included the radicalization of U.S.-backed fighters, the emergence of extremist networks like al-Qaeda, and the destabilization of Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal. This technique made it clear that while the U.S. achieved its short-term strategic goal of forcing a Soviet retreat, it came at the cost of long-term regional security and global counterterrorism consequences. This was a critical national security interest rooted in Cold War dynamics. Both Presidents Carter and Reagan made full use of the NSC, the CIA, and military planning to counter the Soviet threat. The approach demonstrated how the U.S. could leverage indirect warfare to influence global outcomes without direct combat. Still, the long-term consequences were underestimated. My suggested course of action would have included early planning for post-conflict stability, engaging U.S. aid and the State Department development programs in tandem with intelligence operations. I would have coordinated across the CIA, the State Department, and the Defense Department to ensure both wartime strategy and post-war reconstruction were aligned. This operation succeeded in pushing back Soviet aggression, but ultimately failed to establish a stable Afghanistan. This case shows that the national security policy must always balance short-term victories with long-term stability planning. For this case study, I relied on a mix of credible sources, including declassified CIA and State Department documents, academic journals, and respected research institutions like Brookings and the Wilson Center. These gave me a strong understanding of U.S. decision-making, Soviet objectives, and the broader Cold War context. The National Security Archive provided real memos from the Carter and the Reagan administrations, while academic articles like the Kakars helped capture the Afghan perspective. Though detailed Mujahideen sources were limited, BBC reports that I found and cross-referenced intelligence filled key gaps. Overall, I'm confident in the credibility and balance of these sources, and that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.